And so without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Kate and we'll get started on home composting.
Great, thank you, Kristen. I'm so excited that there are so many people here today joining us to learn about home composting. So we'll get started. What is compost? Compost is the result from the managed decomposition of organic matter. Organic in this instance is just referring to carbon-based or once living, like your garden waste, leaves, or food scraps. Compost is the nutrient-rich soil amendment that is dark and crumbly and it smells earth-like, but it's different from soil. So soil is the topmost layer of the Earth's crust and contains decomposed organic matter, but also minerals and broken up rocks that help provide the structure plants need to grow. In order to make compost, we manage our collected organic materials by creating the optimal environment for decomposers to break down materials so that they break down quickly, efficiently, and most importantly, without producing a bad smell. And they break down into the valuable product loved by gardeners to help plants grow. Kristen, can you put up the first poll? Or the second poll? Okay, so just to get an idea of who we have joining us today, want to know what your composting experience is. Are you a master composter? Have you dabbled in some decomposition? Are you just getting started? Great, and it looks like just a few more votes coming in, but it looks like we've got a couple of experts with us today, so we'll be looking for your help when we answer the questions, and a good mix of experience. So today we are going to be discussing the benefits and uses of compost, and then two different compost systems: a backyard composting system and a worm bin. Hopefully there is something in there for everyone. And we're going to jump right in with the benefits of compost, which start with the inputs, the materials used to make compost. And compost diverts food scraps from landfill as part of the food recovery hierarchy. And just like recycling, which is reduce, reuse, and recycling, a part of the 3 R's, recycle is the last option before we send materials to landfill. And compost is the last option before we send food waste to landfill. We first want to reduce sources of food waste in the areas where food is produced, and then we want to redistribute food so that it gets to those who need it. And further down, we can consider composting as a way to manage our food scraps. This is a really great lesson for students to learn as part of the food system, and it's something that we work into our programming with students at New York City Zero Waste Schools, where schools are collecting food waste and compostable plates in the cafeteria. So compost makes something highly valuable and useful out of waste product, be it grass clippings, any of the materials you may have in your garden, New York City cafeteria waste, or food waste at home. And even before we're thinking about it as a valuable resource for gardens, compost is a benefit that diverts organic material from the waste stream and allows us to rethink and revalue that material, not as waste, but rather as a valuable resource needed to create a useful end product. And what benefits does that useful end product have for your garden? Compost can help condition your soil for optimal plant growth, and that's really what we're using it for in the garden. As I mentioned before, soil is made up of decomposed organic material and minerals. Those minerals can be sand, silt, or clay in any combination. Loamy soil, this one in the middle here, is sort of the Goldilocks of soil. It contains all 3 mineral types in just the right combination so that it can have adequate water retention, space for the roots to grow with air pockets to stay oxygenated. But if soil is too clay or too sandy, adding compost can help bring soil back to this sort of more ideal loamy texture. Sandy soils, for example, are very porous and don't retain moisture very well. Water seeps right through a sandy soil before it can be taken up by roots, and compost can help sandy soil form those clumps of soil or aggregates that help to retain moisture. Clay soils, on the other hand, are very dense and thick. They can have, they're tightly packed, and so roots can have a hard time finding space to grow in clay soils. And also water does not permeate very well through a clay soil. So over time, the addition of compost or organic material to clay soils can help change the structure of the soil so that it drains and plant roots can grow better. Compost does contain macro and micronutrients that plants need to grow, but it's the biological activity in compost that makes it easier for plants to access these nutrients. The microbes in compost continue consuming tiny bits of the organic matter and releasing nutrients so that plants can use those nutrients. And then by improving soil health so that it retains water, provides space for the roots to grow, adds the air pockets around the roots, compost creates a healthier, more vigorous plant that is less susceptible to disease. A healthy plant is the first line of defense against plant disease. Adding compost to your plants will also suppress weeds that may be in your garden soil. When you first plant your garden, you may be disturbing the soil, which can expose dormant weed seeds, and they'll germinate along with all of the watering that you're doing with your plants that you intend to water. You'll be watering those dormant weed seeds, and they can compete with your flowers and vegetables. So surrounding your plants with compost as mulch will help to keep those weed seeds at bay and prevent them from germinating. So the benefits of soil health go beyond your garden to provide benefits for the larger environment. Because adding compost improves water retention and promotes root growth, we can use compost in projects to prevent erosion. The added capacity for water retention will prevent soils from washing away during rain events, and soil will absorb more of the water as well. If used in conjunction with plantings such as ground covering, the compost will help a strong root system hold together the soil. Because compost makes the nutrients in soil more readily available to plants, it reduces the need for added fertilizers. Synthetic fertilizers can overload the soil with too many nutrients in a form that plants can't readily access. It could also harm the microorganisms living in the soil that create that healthy soil environment for plants to grow. And if you're creating a less healthy environment for plants to grow, they won't be as strong or as vigorous and maybe more susceptible to disease and create the need for more use of synthetic pesticides. So compost can break this cycle by feeding the soil rather than just trying to directly feed the plant as synthetic fertilizer does. In several ways, compost helps reduce greenhouse gas emissions. When plant material and food waste break down in landfills in an environment without oxygen, an anaerobic environment, they release greenhouse gases such as methane and nitrous oxide. So when we compost, we're reducing the emission of these gases by preventing those materials from going to a landfill where they break down anaerobically. Compost facilities are also often more located closer to the area where food waste is produced than landfills. Because food waste and plant materials are wet, they're often the heaviest part of our waste stream. And so transporting those materials by truck, train, by whatever method we're doing the use of those transportation methods can release greenhouse gases. By reducing the distance those materials have to travel to get to a compost facility, we can reduce those emissions. And then pesticides and fertilizers, because compost can reduce the need for pesticides and fertilizers, we can reduce the greenhouse gas emissions that those materials contribute to the environment. And finally, soil is a carbon sink. And soil that has compost in it has been shown to sequester more carbon than conventional soil. So a lot of benefits from that soil, from that great compost. And we want to know how we can divert food scraps, improve soil health, and mitigate climate change in our homes. And we can do all of that with a banana peel. It's kind of amazing. There are a variety of ways that we can work compost into our gardens. They're all fairly simple. Once you have the finished product, which we will discuss coming up soon, once you have the finished product, you can simply mix it into the potting soil that you're using to start seeds or potting plants. About 1/3 compost is a good amount to add to the mix. Similarly, mix compost directly into your garden beds or containers before you plant in them. Again, 1/3 mix in the potting soil is good. If you already have established plants, we discussed this a little bit for weed seed suppression, but if you already have established plants, you can't really dig the compost in. You'll disturb the root systems, but you can add it to the top of your compost, of your garden bed. You'll help suppress the weeds, and the nutrients and beneficial organisms and bacteria in the soil will work their way into the soil when watered or when it rains. And then if you are interested in diverting your food scraps from landfill, but you don't have a huge need for the finished compost, you can always give away the compost to friends, families, neighbors, or to feed street trees. I've done this when I found I've had an excess of worm castings. Street trees are often covered by cement, and leaves are removed from the system. When we have street sweepers come by, or we rake up the leaves and bag them and they're taken, they don't break down and return to the nutrient cycle around the tree. And so giving a little bit of compost love to our street trees will help them to be healthy and provide the benefits of having trees in our city. And more. So the next 2 slides go specifically into 2 benefits that needed a little bit further explanation. It's not just mixing or adding some compost onto the top of some soil. Compost heat, can be controversial and a little complex, but some methods require purchasing aerators or purchasing special containers. This is an easy recipe that will get some of the benefits of compost directly to the roots of your plants when watering them. You can simply mix 2 cups of finished compost with 1 gallon of water in a bucket, and leave it for 2 to 5 days, making sure to stir it every single day to get some oxygen into that water. And then at the end of that period, you can pour the water onto your plants, whether they be house plants or out in your garden. You may want to strain the compost tea just because it will clog up whatever, if you're using a watering can, it may clog up the holes, but it's also fine to use that solid compost material directly on the plants and just pour it all on there. And then this is one of my favorite uses of compost that I have yet to achieve. It's a life goal of mine to be able to harness the heat that comes from the compost pile. One day, I will get hot water from my compost pile. The action of microorganisms breaking down organic materials creates a lot of heat. There's an optimal heat in compost of about 140 degrees, but a pile can reach up to 170 degrees. By running water through a heat-conducting metal pipe that's tightly coiled around the middle of a compost pile, you can transfer the heat of compost to the water to run hot water in your home, or even to a hot tub. This is a little pie-in-the-sky aspirational, but it exists, it's out there, and it's just a fun concept. More accessible, heat from the compost pile can be used to heat up a greenhouse. You can have a compost bin in your greenhouse, and if you use a metal seed starting tray or a shelf to put your seeds on, and have that somehow in the compost pile, making connection to the compost pile, you can heat up the temperature of the soil, which can lead to earlier seed germination. So now that we're all excited about the benefits and uses of compost, let's look at how to actually make compost. Really what you're doing is setting up a home for decomposers. You will feed these decomposers, you'll keep them healthy and happy, and they'll do all of the work for you. Worms get all of the recognition for making compost, but there are a whole host of organisms that work in a compost bin, from microscopic bacteria to larger insects. Many are actually not eating the materials that you're adding to the compost, but are in fact eating the fungi and bacteria that are on the surface of the organic materials. You'll see many creepy crawlies in your compost, and most are beneficial. What type of home you establish for these decomposers is going to depend on your space and the amount of materials that you produce. So if you have the space and larger quantities of materials, you may want to establish a backyard bin. This can also be useful in a community garden and at a school. Worm bins are good for indoor composting. and they can be used to process a fairly large amount of material. You can process the food scraps from a family of 4 in a single worm bin. Maybe not all of the food scraps, especially since we are choosy about some of the food scraps that go into worm bins, but a considerable amount. So taking a closer look at backyard composting and the type of systems that are available to you, these are 3 of the most commonly used systems. And this first bin, a stationary bin, is it's very simple, very accessible in that it's easy to use, and you can continuously add material to the top of the bin and then harvest material out of the bottom of the bin. The tumbler is another enclosed system that you can use in your backyard. It's slightly more expensive. The benefit of this tumbler is that you can spin it to add oxygen into your environment, which is very necessary in order to keep odors down and to keep those beneficial bacteria and organisms happy and healthy. It's also great because it is removed from the ground. It's not at ground level, and so this can help with if you have rodent issues, and help prevent rat populations from accessing your compost. And this 3-bin compost system at the end, you can see it has a wide range of cost. That's because it depends on the materials that you are using to build that compost bin. So I've built several 3-bin compost systems, and the first one I ever built was using wooden pallets and wire that I had around, and just any old screws that I had, and that was a $0 3-bin compost system. But I've also built bins where I purchased specific rot-resistant lumber and hardware for that bin for a community garden situation, and so it can vary. You can find the materials or purchase materials. The benefit of a 3-bin system is that it will manage quite a lot of the materials, quite a lot of organic material. You start out by adding all of your materials in this first bin, and as that gets filled up, you can then move it over into the second bin, and in the process of doing that, you're introducing air into the system. It's a great way of keeping a healthy compost. You let this material sit and begin to decompose while you then again fill up the first part of that 3-bin system. So once you've chosen which system you're going to implement in your backyard, you need to add the materials to it. Compost is really, it's an art and a science, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the art of compost. There are a lot of resources you can find that will talk about the very specific ratios of materials that you need to add to your compost pile. But we're going to do more of the visual amount of materials that you need to add to your pile. You will be adding greens, which are the nitrogen-rich materials such as grass clippings, coffee grounds, tea bags, your leftover fruit and veggie peels, trimmings from plants, eggshells, and if you have access to them, a really great green to add to your compost pile is chicken or cow or any animal manure, except for domesticated pets. The browns in the pile are the carbon-rich materials, and these are dried leaves, hay, straw, drier materials that are very high in carbon. These help to aerate the compost pile. They're not as wet as the greens material, so they help to add bulk to your compost and help to air to move around in the compost pile. They also help to keep down odor, and because they are drier, they absorb some of the moisture that's coming out of those wet green materials. There are items that you want to avoid adding to your compost bin. Meat and fats and oily materials are harder to break down. You don't want to add those into your bin. Grains, these are not a good thing to add into a bin because they can attract pests. They will break down in a compost bin. That's not really the issue. It's more so that you don't want to be providing a food source for anything other than the organisms that we want to be attracting to the compost bin. Definitely leaving out cat and dog waste. You can add weeds to your compost bin. Laura, in our first session on Monday, gave a great tip of pulling out your weed and letting it dry out in the sun. to help kill any weed seeds that may, if your weed has gone to seed. But you can then put it into the compost pile because compost gets so hot, it will kill any weed seed if properly managed. And then diseased plants, again, for the same reason, because you don't want to be introducing disease back into your garden system. I would leave out diseased plants. It's possible that the compost could eliminate them through heat, but that's a little bit something I don't want to mess with. I don't want to introduce disease back into my garden. So you mix all of these materials together. You don't have to add any of the organisms into the compost pile. We'll discuss in worm bin how you specifically introduce a specific organism into the bin. But in the compost pile outside, those insects are going to find their way to your pile. You want to make sure that you do maybe throw in a couple of handfuls of dirt to inoculate the pile with some of the good bacteria that will start decomposition. But other than that, the worms, the insects, they'll find their way. As you've mixed all of this together and it's been decomposing for a while and you've been observing and watching your pile, you may find that you have a few issues that are not optimal for your decomposer environment. If your compost pile is too wet, your compost pile may become anaerobic. The very first compost that I managed it smelled. Had a horrendous smell. And through multiple days of trying to figure out what the issue was, I finally realized that it was positioned underneath the sloping roof of a garage. And so every time it rained, the rain from the roof went directly onto the compost pile and just waterlogged the whole thing. And it became an anaerobic decomposition environment, which will smell. So if your compost pile is too wet, you want to look at where it is situated. If it's getting too much rainwater, and you want to look at if you are adding too many green materials and add in some extra browns to help dry it out. If it's too dry, the opposite will happen. The decomposers will not be happy. They like to have a moist environment. So you can add in some more green material, or you can simply get a watering can and add some water to it if it hasn't rained for a while. For instance, it may have dried out. If the compost pile is not hot, that means decomposition is not happening, and you might want to add stir the compost a little bit, add some air into the system, and add in some more greens to fire things up again. And then if you have plants growing in your compost system, this is an interesting one. That's an indication that it's not hot. It's a problem if those are weeds. You don't want to be, you want the weeds to be killed, but it's also an interesting thing to find. I have an avocado plant that germinated and grew to be about 1 foot tall in my compost pile that I now have potted in my house. And I've also had squash self-germinate in my compost pile. So you might want to grab some of those plants that are growing in your compost pile. If a compost pile is not in the books for you, you don't have access to an outside area, you can easily compost inside with a worm bin. You need a few special things for a worm bin. You can go online and buy the fanciest worm hotels with tiers and different sections and make a bench that looks pretty to put your worms in. But we're just talking about the basic worm bin for today. And for that, you'll need a bin. You can use any bin with a lid that is around your home. And I'm gonna have to really speed up because we've only got a few minutes left. But you'll want to drill holes into that bin so that there's air for the worms that you'll be introducing. You'll also want to have water so that you can wet down any of the bedding material that is in the bin. Bedding for a worm bin, great bedding is shredded newspaper, brown paper towel, brown paper bags, paper towel, cardboard are all great beddings to add. And then of course you need to add your food, which is the input that we want to turn as have become a valuable resource. Finally, you can add your worms. Icenia fetida, aka red wigglers, are the ideal worm for an at-home compost bin. They like to live in a communal setting. You'll see them bumping right up against each other and they're fine with that. They tolerate the same temperatures that we like in our home, so that's a benefit, and they eat a lot. The foods that they like to eat are vegetable and fruit scraps, coffee grounds, tea, eggshells. They do not like citrus, and although you can put meat and grains into a worm bin, I avoid them for odor issues. So those are some things to avoid. You can feed your worms weekly or daily. It depends on how much materials you have and how you want to best add them into your bin. Just simply pull aside some bedding, put the food in, cover it up, and let the worms do their work. You'll see this picture of food. It looks a little bit frosty. That's because I've frozen the food before adding it to the bin. By freezing the food, you can help prevent fruit fly infestations in your worm bin. Worms will eat their body weight in food, and so that food also includes the bedding, which is why 3.5 pounds of food per pound of worms is about the amount that they can eat. And this chart just shows the amount of space you need in order to support that amount of worms. A 1 square foot, which is a pretty small bin, can support 1 pound of worms, which can eat 3.5 pounds of food waste. My worm bin at home is a regular sized Rubbermaid tote, and it probably has about 3 pounds of food in it. And I don't know if I get up to 10.5 pounds of food feeding it every single week, but the worms do go very quickly through that amount of food. I do want to add here that you don't have to purchase, if you want to have you want to go through 14 pounds, you don't have to purchase 4 pounds of worms. The worms will reproduce to fill the space that you have. So start with 1 pound of worms and let them fill the space that they have. Once you've created, and Chantal, how are we doing for time? Am I out? Yeah, okay. So a couple of different ways I just got 2 slides left. So there are 2 ways that you can harvest the compost as soon as it's been processed by the worms. You can divide the bin and just let the worms move over to the side where the food and the bedding is, and they will leave the side that is empty, then scoop that out. A fun one is to do with a group of students or with any group is to dump out the worm bin, pile it up. The worms will move away from the light, and you can just sort of scoop the top of the worm castings off of those piles until you just have a pile of wriggling worms left. A couple of issues with compost bins: flies. We discussed that you should freeze your materials before adding them to the compost bin. If it is smelly, it's the same as an outdoor compost bin. It's probably too wet and has gone anaerobic. Escaping worms. If you open up your lid and all your worms are at the top trying to get out of the bin, it's because the environment is too wet and they can drown and they want to get out of there. And I can't see the last one because my my video is over it. Die off. If you do experience a worm die off, you will want to just dump that worm bin and start over. Maybe consider why they died off. Were they too hot? Did they freeze? But sometimes it's just a disease that the worms get. It's happened to everybody, and you just dump that batch and you'll start over again. Thank you. I think that we will now take some questions.
Yes, we have so many good questions. So thank you everyone for submitting. If we don't get to your questions, which we're going to answer for about another 10 minutes right now, we will answer them and post them on growmyseeddistancelearning.org, which will be emailed later tonight as soon as we are finished answering all of your fantastic questions. So the first one that we've got, Kate, is that a lot of people are asking if they can use newspapers as ground, especially if they're doing indoor. Yeah.
Especially if you're doing indoor. Absolutely. Newspaper is a great brown to use. Even if it has, even if it's a colored ink newspaper, you can use that as a bedding for your worm bin or adding it to your compost pile.
We're also getting a lot of questions in here, especially from our indoor composters who want to know how to keep away ants and roaches if they're composting indoors.
Yeah, that's a great question. And to be honest, I have composted indoors in an apartment that has had insect problems, and those insects have not been so attracted to my worm bin because it's very enclosed, has a lid, and I've kept it in a cupboard. I have not had those bugs find their way to the worm bin. I would say if for ants, you could sprinkle some diatomaceous earth, and for cockroaches, some diatomaceous earth around the bin, and that would prevent them from marching over to it.
Folks are also asking if they should be freezing their food scraps first before adding it to their indoor or outdoor compost piles.
So for your indoor compost pile, certainly freeze your materials first. That prevents any fruit fly eggs that are on the peels and skins of all of our fruits and vegetables. That's where fruit flies come from. They already exist. The eggs are already there. They're minuscule. We don't see them. But if you freeze those materials, you'll kill off the egg, and then you can add it to your indoor compost bin. For an outdoor compost bin, there's no reason to freeze your food. The only reason you would freeze your food when adding to an outdoor compost bin is if you're keeping it inside for a while and you just want to make sure that there's no bad odors inside your home. So if you're collecting it to take it to a community compost site, you might want to put those materials in the freezer, but there's no need to kill off any of the fruit fly eggs. They're going to find their way to an outdoor pile regardless.
People are asking where they can purchase worms and if there's a
great
program.
question. I skipped over that in the presentation. There are lots of online sources for purchasing worms. You can just go online and Google red wigglers. They cost about $30 a pound. The Lower East Side Ecology Center in New York City also was providing worms at the Union Square Green Market. Right now that operation may not be happening, and so if you go to their website, there's a number and an email you can call to contact them to find out if they are returning to market with worms. The benefit of the Lower East Side Ecology Center is that their worms are significantly less expensive than worms available on site, and you're also supporting a great environmental nonprofit.
Let's say that you have a countertop compost bin. People are asking how long it takes for that to reach mature compost.
Sure. So with a worm bin, it's going to take from initial setup maybe about 8 weeks before you begin to see enough materials to harvest. But the materials that you put in, within a week, the worms will make use of all of that food product, and you'll see it disappear. But if you're continuously adding to it over about an 8-week period, you'll begin to see materials that you can harvest. But you can also let it sit for months and months and just let that material build up. It's somewhat inconvenient to harvest frequently, and so you might want to wait until you've got a good amount of materials in there.
One of our viewers today made their own compost bin out of a 22-gallon trash bin, and
Yes.
They drilled some holes at the bottom, and they are wondering if they can add worms to that outside.
Yeah, so was it a metal trash bin or a plastic trash bin? Was there any?
I believe it's plastic.
Okay. I just asking because I think a metal trash can might heat up a little bit more than a plastic trash can. You can certainly add worms, and if you've drilled holes in the bottom, they may already be in your trash can. I guess we should just draw a distinction between the red wiggler, Icenia fetida, and then the earthworms that you might find in a regular compost bin. Your outdoor compost is likely not going to attract red wiggler worms. There are specialized worms sold very specifically as bait or for indoor composting, and they're slightly different. They live in that more communal environment of a worm bin. You can add red wigglers to an outdoor worm bin. It's just in the winter they're not going to survive.
I think we have time for one more question. And so they are asking, will compost bins attract feral cats and other feral animals?
So cats, I don't know about, but definitely other feral animals. And so there are some controls you can do to prevent animals from getting into your compost bin. It depends on where you're situated, but even in the city, there are raccoons. I'd say they would be highly attracted to eating all of the bugs that are feasting on your decomposing materials. So you can, if you're building a bin, you can make sure that the lid latches if it's an enclosed bin so that animals can't flip the lid open and get into it. Specifically for rats in the city, the bin that I had built, the 3-bin compost system at a community compost site, I put a 3-inch layer of gravel down underneath it, not small gravel, so like rock gravel to prevent rats from being able to burrow into the compost pile. So there are things you can do to prevent attracting animals. Animals are crafty, they will find their way.
Awesome. Well, I think that's all the time we have today for questions, but we will answer every single question that you've put in the chat and in the Q&A on our distance learning page. You will have that a little later today. We have 2 more workshops this week. We have natural pest management tomorrow with Chantel, and then we have Q&A with the Teaching Garden on Friday. So if you haven't done so already, please remember to sign up via Eventbrite for those so that you'll get your links. We will send it to you after this. And last, if you enjoyed today's workshop and you wanted to leave a little donation, you can visit grownyc.org to keep our work going into the summer and beyond. So special thanks to Kate for leading our presentation today, and to our co-hosts, and so many thanks to all of you who tuned in. So thank you so much, and we hope that we'll get to see you all tomorrow at Natural Pest Management. All right, have a good night, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.